Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'd like to discuss the first phase of Brexit standards controls coming online at the end of the month, partly because it's really important and partly because I'm seeing a lot of well-meaning people failing to note the distinction between the phases. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel. So lots of noise about the incoming Brexit standards controls. Now, for those thinking, as most voters do, that Brexit has essentially been done now, the government can move on. No, not even close. There are lots of consequences of Brexit, particularly the extreme Tory Brexit that we embarked on. But by far the most visible are the trade barriers that it brought. But although trade barriers were raised against our market in the EU, we did not immediately raise ours against the EU. It took us a year to implement customs controls on imports from the EU, and even now we carry out very few checks, which means that smugglers are having a great old time. As for standards controls, we still don't have them. It's over 3 years since we left the single market. We've had standards controls on our exports to the EU, but none on EU exports to us. We're about to begin. The first phase is at the end of this month, next week. Unfortunately, I've seen a lot of people talking about how these standards controls are going to impact trade and describing it as happening next week. This isn't helpful because what will happen in a few weeks' time is the Brexiteers go, oh, look, the Remainers all said the sky was going to fall in again. And look, nothing's really happened because it's not intended to happen just yet. So we must make sure we know exactly what's going on. Standards controls involve extra costs and documentation as well as checks for compliance. But that is not all happening next week. We are implementing standards controls in 3 phases. Next week is just phase 1. So what is phase 1? It's the implementation of health certificates for certain goods. There will be no checks, as some people are claiming. That is not to say that nothing will go wrong, and it's certainly not to say there will be no impact. Checks are there to ensure compliance of rules, but most businesses comply with rules anyway without the need for checks. So the businesses who understand the rules and are not trying to break them, the impact will be that some plant and animal products that we currently import will not be available anymore. One obvious consequence will be, say, specialist foods. Things like delis. Delis are particularly worried at the moment. We're talking about specialist foods imported in small consignments because the cost of the health certificate would make the price too high. We will essentially see some products being unavailable, although these will tend to be, as I say, specialist goods, so the more expensive ones, which only so many people will notice. But the health certification is still a cost. Even if the cost can still make the trade in larger quantities of goods worthwhile, it still means the cost of some goods, including food, will increase. But because there are no checks, I imagine the government are aiming to make sure that the major problems don't actually occur in this phase. But there are 2 major problems with even this first phase. The first, as I said, is it won't be worth the cost of the certification for some goods. Also, some specialist goods, because they're not large consignments, tend to share pallets for transport with others. You can't be mixing goods when certificates are needed. Essentially, it just won't be worth some suppliers exporting to Britain at all. Second, you need to find a vet to complete the health certificates. That means there will be overnight greater demand for vets or other qualified professionals. It's not just a case of paying for the health certificate. You have to get someone to carry out an inspection to award you the certificate. So some will struggle. So some goods will not be exported to us simply because it's too much hassle to get the certification arranged, even if the cost is not itself a limiting factor. But all of this is relatively minor compared to what does come later. It mostly affects smaller consignments, which are not the goods bought by most people, although it could piss off some key voters still, the old middle classes there. The major problems kick in when checks happen. This is right at the end of April. This is when everyone is affected. And they're going to be ramped up until the end of October. So you can sort of think about the checks as taking place from the 1st of May to the 1st of November. It's not happening just yet. Now, there are a number of major problems when the checks do happen. The first is that checks take time. And given that none are happening now, it means an inevitable slowing down of freight traffic. It means that lorries delivering affected goods will have longer journey times and so can transport fewer consignments within a particular time frame, which means that it takes longer to get your goods. And with a shortage of lorry drivers, it means some goods we won't be able to get deliveries at all. If we had a glut of lorry drivers, had loads of lorry drivers, it would just mean paying more for the delivery because that lorry is having to take longer over fewer consignments, and just getting more lorry drivers to deliver the rest, but we have a shortage. So it'll just mean there'll be some deliveries. Oh, sorry, we can't arrange transportation, right? That's just inevitable. And that is in addition to the goods where we'll have shortages of because of health certification not being worthwhile, right? Second, there isn't actually room around Dover to carry out these checks. So it's not a case of lorry comes across from Calais and, oh, can you pull aside so we can check, please? That's not going to happen. There's no room there. So the lorries are going to need direct into inland centres to manage this. That will add even more time to the journey because it's not simply a delay for the time needed to carry out the checks, but the lorry has to be diverted from its planned route for the check to take place. So that's an extra delay. That means waiting even longer for your goods and even fewer journeys possible by the limited number of lorry drivers. To say nothing of the fact we may end up with another situation whereby some EU lorry drivers go, can't be bothered with all this, I'm not doing the Britain run. Third, it gets better. Logistics firms are saying that the government haven't really explained to them in detail how this is all supposed to work in practice, and it's a few weeks away. Where do they need to go? They don't know. This means that on top of the time needed to divert and check the lorries, there may be extra delays caused by confusion with the new system. Fourth, what happens when checks uncover problems? When the EU applied standards controls to British imports, lots of consignments got stopped because of errors with the paperwork. The same will happen for EU imports from May. It may be that some goods can't go there and the business exporting them didn't realise. So it's like, sorry, you can't export this now. It may be that the goods are absolutely fine, but the certification isn't proving it due to errors or omissions. This will mean you get one number wrong and it could hold the whole thing up. That can mean further delays because do you know what takes longer than a standards check? A standards check that finds a problem with the paperwork. It also means more shortages because those goods won't be allowed through without the paperwork being in order. And of course, the lorry driver just stuck there going, I'm not doing this again. And the fifth major problem is that these standards checks are going to be ramped up over a period of time from the start of May to the start of November. And as each new set of checks comes online, there's the potential for not only more delays, because it'll be more checks taking place, but more things to go wrong. However, from about August through to December, what usually happens each year is trade ramps up, as it does every autumn. As we build up to Christmas, the amount of imports that we get from Europe increases because businesses are buying more in because people are buying more. So we'll be getting to the business end of implementing these checks, just as British businesses will be trying to import their peak volumes of the year. This is a recipe for disaster. But of course, the Tories are planning on a May 2nd general election. No matter what their mates in the media say, this means that the checks do not even begin until the week of the election, and then it's Labour's problem to deal with it at that point. In fact, if the election is on May the 2nd, it will be particularly spiteful because it means the checks begin at a time when there will effectively be no government to deal with any major cock-ups when it launches. But for those who do believe in the November election, and it is possible, ask yourselves why the Tories would set a timetable which invites increasing shortages of food over the summer and all the way to the election. Now, the Tories want to leave this little gift for Labour, but what will Labour do? Not what Simon Jenkins in The Guardian is arguing. He says, this is good to raise the cost of doing business for Britain by £330 million a year. Yeah, maybe, but we can't just not do it, as he urges. He says that Sunak is bringing these checks in out of a sense of Brexit machismo. No, he's not. Standards checks are absolutely vital. It's already taken too long. This is the price of leaving the single market. There isn't another way to do it. Labour cannot take us back into the single market quickly, not even in their first term, although I have higher hopes for the second term. We know that Labour plans a veterinary agreement with the EU to reduce the level of checks needed, but because this will not be straightforward, legally or politically, it will take time, if we ever get it at all. Put simply, these standards checks need to go ahead. Labour will have to stick with them. It is a cost of hard Brexit and one that must be paid. Without them, there are two serious consequences. First, we risk importing an animal disease which devastates an already embattled farming industry. If Labour preside over that, there will be savaging in the media. Second, not having the checks means giving EU businesses a competitive advantage over our own, because it means that they can export to the British market with lower trade friction than British businesses to the EU market. So that means if you're deciding where to set up as a business, if you want to supply both the British and the EU markets, where do you set up? You set up in the EU, because then you can export to Britain with no standards checks, and you can export round to the rest of the single market with no standards checks. Whereas if you base yourself in Britain, you can supply the smaller British market without any checks, sure, okay, but you can't export to the EU without standards checks. So that's just a huge advantage to the EU. And that would leave us in a weak position when we want to negotiate improvements for trade with the EU. It means we won't be able to negotiate anything significant because, you know, we'll say to the EU, can you lower your trade barriers to us? And the EU will say, well, what are you going to give us in return? Well, we'll lower our trade barriers to you. You've already lowered them to the floor. Doesn't work. So we're stuck with it. They should have been implemented before now. The Tories put them off because they didn't want to deal with the visible consequences of Brexit. That's what the Tories are. They don't want to accept responsibility for their own actions. And this will be the most visible consequence of Brexit. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. I hope you found the video interesting. If you did, please click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, the join button for memberships. And until next time, I'll see you later.